I'll admit it, I'm not a big fan of country music. Well, maybe a little Johnny Cash. But really, come on, who doesn't like Johnny Cash? I've always been more of a metalhead. But having said that, country music has put out some pretty decent ballads about historical events. Ballads that would go on to keep the events still somewhat in the public consciousness, even if the ballad is somewhat fictionalized. Case in point, The Wreck of the Old 97, a ballad about a train wreck in 1903 that was written in 1924 that would go on to be covered by multiple country singers over the years, including good old Johnny Cash. So, what really happened? I'm Andrew, and this is History's a Disaster. Tonight, we're diving into the wreck of the Old 97, a train wreck way back in 1903 outside of Danville, Virginia. And after that, a little bit of music history, just because, well, I found it rather interesting. And tonight's episode is brought to you by Billy Bob's Banjo Bonanza, the hottest thrash grass music festival this side of Appalachia. So grab some moonshine and head on down this Sunday and see the hottest acts in thrash grass, with headliners like Foreign Whimper, the 38 Special Rubber Band, with special guests Chasm Village Saints and Black Eyed Roland. Get your tickets now. The Old 97 was the affectionate nickname given to the Southern Railroad line's fast mail. The fast mail was pulled by locomotive Southern Railway 1102, which was a new Baldwin steam locomotive built earlier in 1903 in Philadelphia. The train also included 2 railway post office cars, a baggage car, and an express car for hauling freight. Southern Railroad at the time held a $140,000 a year contract to deliver mail between Washington, D.C. and New Orleans, which is, well, quite a lot of money, especially back in 1903. The one downside to the contract was the heavy fines for being late. These fines could be as high as $200 for being an hour late making a delivery. Back in 1903, $200 would be around $5,000 today. So obviously, if you're late a lot, those fines can add up very quickly. However, in the 10 months the fast mail had been operating, it quickly earned a reputation for always being on time. A point of pride for the owners of Southern Railroad and something they were bound and determined to keep. Even if it meant gently persuading their conductors to push the train just a little faster than was maybe necessary to make sure they were on time. On September 27th, 1903, however, the fast mail was behind schedule due to connecting trains being late when it left Washington, D.C., which meant it was an hour late getting to Monroe, Virginia. Before leaving Monroe, the train crew switched out and they left with 17 people on the train. The train personnel included engineer Steve Brody, who would be running the fast mail for the first time, although he had previously worked running heavier freight trains, so he wasn't a brand new engineer. You had conductor John Blair, firemen's A.C. Clapp and John Hodge, flagman James Robert Moody, and a whole lot of mail carriers. J.L. Thompson, Scott Chambers, Daniel Flory, Paul Argenbright, Louis Spies, Frank Brooks, Percival Indermeyer, Charles Reams, Jennings Dunlap, M.C. Muffin, J.H. Thompson, and W.R. Pinckney, an express passenger. When the train pulled into Lynchburg, Wentworth Armistead, a safe locker, who is the only guy trusted with the combination to the safe, got on board, bringing the total number to 18 on the train. Before they left Monroe, however, Brody was told he better get his ass to Spencer, North Carolina quick. They needed to make up for the lost time since they were behind schedule. And according to their schedule, Spencer is 166 miles away and should normally take just over 4 hours to get there at the average speed of 39 miles an hour. But since they were an hour behind, he needed to increase that average to 51 to make up the difference. And Brody was often quoted as saying, come hell or high water, he would put that train in on time. Also, to help make up some time, he was told to skip the stop at Franklin Junction in Gretna. It was a normal stop on the run, but not really needed, so he could just blow right through there without stopping or slowing down. They would also continue through Chatham and Dry Forks without slowing. In Dry Forks, they just tossed out the mailbag as they sped through, but they failed to grab the bag full of outgoing mail from the pole at the depot. Now, the route between Monroe and Spencer was rather hilly, which made for a dangerous combination of steep inclines and declines and tight curves they'd have to run through. Because of this, there was signs posted all over the route to remind the engineers to slow their asses down as they plowed through the area. But Brody, acting under orders from the bosses, just ignored the signs and plowed through it, not slowing down and pushing the train as fast as he thought it could go. When they passed through the small freight depot in Lima, they hit a steep 3-mile-long downgrade heading to Stillhouse Trestle, a 40-foot-high bridge that ran over the Stillhouse Creek. The air brakes failed to slow the train down, and they were rapidly approaching the curve before the bridge. Brody threw the train into reverse to try to slow it down, but the train just threw out smoke and sparks, and its whistle screamed. But still, the runaway train would not slow. And since they couldn't slow down, and they were going way too fast, the train missed the curve and jumped the tracks, plunging into the ravine below. The locomotive slammed into the bottom of Stillhouse Creek, the 4 cars behind it raining down on top of it. As the rail cars shattered on impact, a fire broke out, spreading throughout the debris. The sound of the crash could be heard throughout the area. The noise and eyewitnesses alerted the fire department to the accident. By the time fire and rescue personnel, along with all the curious onlookers, because, well, as we know, everyone loves a train wreck, got there, the heat from the blaze was hot enough they had a hell of a time getting close enough to fight back the flames. As they moved through the shattered debris of the train, yellow canaries hopped and chirped through the wreckage. They had been destined for a coal mine, but the crash broke open their crates and set them free. The train wreck saved them from a far worse fate of dying in some mine. Along with the canaries, very little of the mail the train carried would end up surviving the fire. So, set against the backdrop of their cheerful chirps, the firefighters pushed back the flames as rescuers pulled the broken bodies of the dead and injured men from the wreck. Some of them were so badly burnt from the fire and the boiler steam they couldn't be recognized. Steve Brody's body had been thrown from the engine when it hit the bottom of the ravine. The steam from the boiler engine had hit him bad enough that his skin was falling off as they moved his body. He was one of the 11 to die from the crash. 6 of the survivors, mostly the mail clerks, were pulled from the wreckage with various injuries. Some of them believed they only survived because they had jumped from the train before it hit the ravine. And the last survivor was the express passenger, W.R. Pinckney. He managed to escape from the crash without a physical scratch on him. Mentally, though, is a whole different story. After he made it home the next day, he immediately called up Southern Railway and quit his job. He'd had enough fun on the trains for a lifetime. 2 other survivors, Jennings Dunlop and M.C. Muppin, did not resign, although they had enough of the fast mail and transferred to new departments. Dunlap went to work on the train that ran between Washington and Charlotte, while Muppin worked at the Charlotte Union Station. Surprisingly, engine 1102 was able to be recovered and sent back to Spencer to be fixed up. They patched it back up at the Spencer shops and put it back into service for another 30 years before chopping it up and selling it for scrap in 1935. The bridge, which was slightly damaged in the accident, was fixed up and saw continued use until 1938, when it was torn down after it had been abandoned by the railways, who were now using an alternate route. Southern Rail continued to run freight and passengers until 1982, when they merged with Norfolk and Western Railway, and became Norfolk Southern, who continues to operate rail services today. A historical marker now marks the site of the crash, and a mural in nearby Danville tells the story of the wreck. A wreck that would make national news and lead to an investigation into the crash, as well as that ballad that would immortalize it. The investigation, if you can really call it much one, was largely rushed and hampered by Southern Railway, who wanted to put all of the blame right on Brody. Of course, blame the dead guy. Besides, they obviously, in no way, shape, or form, ever placed any sort of pressure on their engineers to meet their timelines. That idea is simply preposterous. He was just going way too fast to control the train speeding down that hill at over 70 miles per hour. Never mind the eyewitnesses that put the speed of the train closer to 50. You can't ever trust an eyewitness. They're just too unreliable. But you know what you can trust? You can always trust big business. They always have the people's interest at heart, and are never merely motivated by increasing their profit margins and lining their own pockets. You can take that to the bank. The one real unknown about the accident is why the brakes failed in the first place. A loss of pressure in the brake system is the most likely reason. To make up time, engineers would often speed into a wide turn, hit the brakes, and then accelerate through the turn. This was a process they called whittling, and it would help them to maintain their speed. If applied too often, though, the brake system would lose pressure, which meant when he needed the brakes the most, there simply wasn't anything the brake system could do since any pressure built up was gone. However, the survivors would later claim that Brody never once hit the brakes after setting out. So, if that's the case, and that's true, then we'll probably never know exactly why Brody could not get the train slowed down enough to make the turn. And since he died in the accident, it's not like he can really offer any opinions either. The country song written about the accident would go on to be recorded by multiple artists over the following decades, keeping the story of the old 97 alive, even with just a tiny bit of artistic license given to some of the events. Like them putting the speed at 90 miles per hour, which is even faster than what the railroad said. They also had absolutely no problem placing all of the blame squarely on the railroads in the ballads. So, good for them. The ballad would also go on to spawn a major copyrights lawsuit and become the first country release, wow, I cannot say release, to sell 1 million records in the United States. The most famous version of the ballad was first recorded by Virginia musicians G.B. Grayson and Henry Whittler. Vernon Dalhart's version was released in 1924 for Victor Records, which would later become RCA, and would become the first country record to hit 1 million in sales and featured Carson Robinson playing guitar and Dalhart playing harmonica. After this, the ballad would be recorded by numerous artists, including Dalhart himself in 1924, under the name Sid Turner, the Statlin Brothers with Johnny Cash, Charlie Louvin of the Louvin Brothers, Pete Seeger, Johnny Cash, Hank Williams III, Boxcar Willie, John Mellencamp, Pink Anderson, and a whole lot of other artists that I really don't want to sit here and just read a bunch of names out. And the latest one was in 2026, the band Old 97, named after the wreck in the ballad, recorded their version of it. The song was often accompanied by a banjo and a fiddle, while the lyrics are either sung, crooned, yodeled, whistled, hummed, recited, or chanted. At one point, it rivaled the song Casey Jones for being the #1 railroading song of all time. The 1932 movie Scarface, starring actress Ann Dvorak, had her singing 2 versions of it. The song was sung to the tune of The Ship That Never Returned, written by Henry Clay Work in 1865. Which doesn't tell me much because I don't know what that song is either, but originally the lyrics were attributed to Fred Jackson Louis and co-author Charles Weston Noel. Louis claimed to have written the song the day after the accident, in which his cousin Albion Clapp was one of the 2 firemen killed. Louis worked in the cotton mill that was at the base of the trestle, and also claimed to be on the scene of the accident pulling the victims from the wreckage. Musician Henry Whittler would come along to polish the original, altering the lyrics, which resulted in the version performed by Dalhart. In 1927, it was claimed that the author, not Arthur, A wreck of the old 97 was local resident David Graves George, who was one of the first on the scene. George was a brakeman and telegraph operator who also just happened to be a singer. So that's a lucky coincidence. Witnessed the tragedy and it inspired him to write the ballad. After the 1924 recording by the Victor Talking Machine Company was released, George filed a claim for ownership. On March 11, 1933, Judge John Boyd proclaimed that George was the true author of the ballad. So, Victor Talking Machine Company, and that is such a great old name, and not glad at all that they eventually changed it, was forced to pay David $65,000 of the profits from about 5 million records sold. Victor would go on to appeal 3 times. The first 2 times, the court told him to fuck off and ruled in favor of George. The 3rd time, the Court of Appeals finally turned it around and sided with Victor Talking Machines. Probably just to shut them up. And maybe, just a guess, maybe just a little bit of a bribe. That's all pure speculation on my part. George appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, but the court ruled that George had filed his appeal too late and dismissed it, thereby granting Victor sole ownership of the ballad. So thanks for listening. If you liked the show, please consider leaving a rating or review on your app of choice. And you can reach out to the show at historiesofdisaster@gmail.com with questions, comments, or suggestions, as well as following the show on social media like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, whatever, you know. And share the episode. Your friends will love it. And you know who would make really great mail carriers? Penguins. That's right, penguins. They're really good at walking, especially in snow and icy weather, often covering distances of 60 miles or more. Okay, so it's mostly just so they can mate, but they still do it, and hey, gotta have something fun to look forward to after all that walking. Anyways, speaking of walking, chase that dream. Live for today, because tomorrow is never guaranteed. Thanks and goodbye.